If you were standing in Modesto in the late 1990s, you have probably seen Scott and Laci Peterson and thought they were the definition of a picture-perfect couple. They met back in 1994 at California Polytechnic State University, two young students who bonded over shared classes, easy smiles, and dreams of the future. By 1996, they were married, building a life that seemed warm and uncomplicated. Friends often described them as stable, cheerful, and normous, the kind of couple, homeowners. Magazines liked featuring on the cover, faced forward a few years, and their lives seemed to only get better. By 2002, Laci was pregnant with their first child, a boy they planned to name Connor. The couple had settled into a quiet neighborhood in Modesto, California, decorating a nursery and taking evening walks with their golden retriever, Mackenzie. Their neighbors remembered Laci's glow, her excitement about motherhood, and the way Scott would proudly talk about becoming a father. But as we often learn, what happens behind closed doors can be very different from what the world sees. Everything changed on the morning of the 24th of December 2002. According to Scott, he left home early to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina Brole 90 miles away. Laci, he said, planned to mop the kitchen floor and walk the dog. Hours later, when Scott returned, he found Mackenzie wandering the neighborhood alone, still on his leash. Laci, however, had vanished. Worry spread fast. That evening, Laci's stepfather contacted the authorities. Police arrived, took statements, and initiated the early stages of a missing person investigation. Friends flooded the streets, putting up posters, knocking on doors, and calling her name into the night. But for investigators, something felt unusual right from the start. Former Detective John Boheller later said that Scott's behavior didn't match that of a frantic husband. Instead of pressing for answers, Scott seemed oddly behind Laci. Volunteers created search groups, helicopters scanned the area, and news channels ran updates every hour. The nation didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of a case that would divide the country, dominate headlines for years, and expose secrets hidden beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary marriage. Nothing made sense. No body, no evidence of a struggle, and no clear explanation for Laci's disappearance. Detectives were left with unanswered questions. But something told them this wasn't a random event. It felt personal. And while the world prayed for Laci's safe return, one shocking revelation was about to explode the case open and change the public's perception of Scott Peterson forever. Retelling. What investigators discovered next didn't just raise suspicion. It flipped the entire investigation upside down and exposed a hidden life Scott hoped no one would ever learn about. As the search for Laci intensified, investigators were sifting through every detail of Scott Peterson's life, from financial records to phone logs, trying to understand what could have happened on that Christmas Eve morning. But none of them were prepared for the twist that arrived. Just 6 days after Laci was reported missing, a phone call came from Fresno, and the woman on the other end had a story that would rewrite the entire investigation. Her name was Amber Frey, a massage therapist and single mother. She told detectives something that made their hearts drop. She had been dating Scott Peterson for over a month. Not only that, Scott had told her he wasn't married. He portrayed himself as a man searching for love, someone emotionally available, someone single. Amber had no idea. She was in the middle of one of the biggest missing person cases in the nation. The detectives immediately met with her, listening as she recounted every detail. And, according to former Detective John Boheller, her memory was astonishing, clear, consistent, and deeply unsettling. She remembered where they met, what they talked about, what they wore, and even the tone of his voice. It was as if she were replaying scenes from a well-rehearsed film. Realizing the potential importance of her information, investigators asked Amber if she would be willing to assist them by recording her phone conversations with Scott. Despite the emotional weight of the situation, Amber agreed. It was a decision that would ultimately become one of the key pillars of the prosecution's future case. Meanwhile, the nation remained fixated on Laci's disappearance. Candlelight vigils filled the nights. Volunteers combed through fields, and news stations broadcasted updates around the clock. But now, a different kind of story was forming. A story of lies, betrayal, and deception. The public, once firmly sympathetic towards Scott, was beginning to see cracks in the facade on fire. On the 24th of January 2003, Amber Frey stood in front of cameras during an emotional press conference. She revealed the affair publicly, saying she had no idea Scott was married until detectives told her. She expressed sympathy for Laci's family and pleaded for the safe return of the missing woman. Her voice trembled, but her message was clear. She had been deceived. Two behind the scenes, the recorded phone calls between her and Scott painted an even darker picture. In one call, Scott told Amber he was spending New Year's Eve in Paris, when in reality he was in Modesto, surrounded by posters of his missing wife. Later he admitted lying to her, saying, "I've been traveling, and I told you wrong." These lies, contradictory, strange, and increasingly suspicious, became powerful ammunition for investigators who were growing less convinced that Laci's disappearance was an accident or coincidence. Every call added to a growing narrative. Scott Peterson had secrets, and those secrets were becoming impossible to ignore, with the world watching and pressure mounting. Investigate evidence. Something undeniable. They were about to get exactly that, but in the most devastating way imaginable. Arhokoke? Days later, something washed ashore on the San Francisco Bay, something that would transform a missing person case into a murder investigation, and push Scott Peterson into the center of a national firestorm by early April 2003. And yet, every new search effort ended the same way. Empty-handed, frustrating, and painfully inconclusive. Investigators were running out of leads, and the public was growing restless. The case had already drawn national attention, but nothing could prepare anyone for what was about to surface along the shores of the San Francisco Bay. On the 13th of April, a passerby, walking near the water, spotted something strange tangled in debris. At first it was hard to identify, weathered, discolored, partially hidden by the rocky shoreline, but as authorities responded and took a closer look, their worst fears solidified. It was a body. The remains appeared to be of a female, and despite the condition, investigators suspected immediately that it might be Laci Peterson. Hope lingered for only a day. On the 14th of April, just a mile from the previous discovery, another body surfaced, this time the remains of a male fetus. And investigators believed the remains belonged to Connor, the unborn child Laci had been carrying. The proximity of the bodies, the timing, and the condition left little doubt. This was the darkest turn the investigation could vipore. The country that had been praying for Laci's safe return suddenly found itself mourning. Family members were heartbroken. Volunteers, who had spent countless hours searching, felt a grim sense of finality. But for investigators, the discovery did something else, to sharpen their focus on the person they had long suspected. Every detail pointed back to Scott Peterson. His alibi placed him at the Berkeley Marina, very same area where the remains were recovered. His unusual behavior in the early days of the investigation, detached, calm, almost rehearsed, came under renewed scrutiny. The lies exposed by Amber Frey only deepened the suspicion. Detectives felt they were no longer dealing with a missing person case but a homicide. Just 4 days after the bodies were found, authorities moved in. On the 18th of April, 2003, Scott Peterson was arrested near a golf course in San Diego. But the circumstances of his arrest raised even more questions. Inside his vehicle, officers discovered a stash of cash, multiple cell phones, and an ID card that belonged to his brother. These were not the belongings of a man planning a casual outing. To many, it looked like the belongings of someone preparing to run when confronted. Scott insisted he was fleeing. But the prosecutors had heard enough. He was charged with 2 counts of murder, first degree for Laci and second degree for baby Connor. Scott entered a plea of not guilty, maintaining his innocence. Yet the public was already forming its own verdict after the arrest. The case intensified. Media outlets ran constant updates. Neighbors whispered about the seemingly perfect husband, who might not have been so perfect after all. And prosecutors began preparing for what would become one of the most highly publicized trials of the decade. But the fight for justice was far from over. The courtroom battle that lay ahead would expose shocking testimony, emotional confrontations, and new revelations that further divided public opinion. Rehookah. As the trial began, one witness stepped forward. Someone whose testimony would shake the entire courtroom and strike a major blow to Scott Peterson's defense. When Scott Peterson's trial officially began on the 1st of June 2004, the courtroom felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a national spectacle. Cameras waited outside from sunrise to sunset. Reporters scrambled for angles, and every major network sent correspondents to cover what had become one of the most polarizing cases in America. The trial had been moved from Modesto to Redwood City, because finding an unbiased jury near Scott's hometown was nearly impossible. Emotions were too high, opinions too sharp, and the public too invested inside the courtroom. Prosecutors laid out their strategy. They didn't have an eyewitness, a murder weapon, or a neat, clear physical trail leading from the Peterson home to the San Francisco Bay. But what they did have was a narrative compelling chain of circumstantial evidence, suspicious behavior, shifting stories, and a man whose life outside his marriage looked drastically different than his public image. Then came a moment the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath for: Amber Frey taking the stand. When Amber walked in, she wasn't the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Calm yet visibly affected, she recounted her relationship with Scott, describing the lies he told her with unsettling ease. She spoke about romantic dates, whispered promises, and all the moments that made her believe Scott was a single man searching for love. She detailed how he talked about future plans with her while his wife was at home, pregnant. But the most damaging blows came from the recordings. Jurors listened to hours of phone conversations between Amber and Scott. In one of the most infamous calls, Scott claimed he was in Paris, describing fireworks, bustling streets, and crowds cheering around him. In reality, he was in Modesto, attending a vigil for his missing wife. The contrast was horrifying. Jurors couldn't look away. Every lie weakened Scott's credibility and strengthened the prosecution's argument that he was capable of deception far beyond infidelity. The courtroom atmosphere grew heavier as witnesses described suspicious details from the days leading up to Laci's disappearance. Some talked about Scott's lack of urgency, his inconsistent timeline, or his strangely calm demeanor. Others revealed details about the Peterson marriage that contradicted the image of a loving couple preparing for their first child. And yet, the defense fought back. They argued that there was no direct evidence tying Scott to the crime. They suggested that Laci might have been abducted, or that unknown individuals were responsible. They pointed to reported sightings of a pregnant woman walking in the neighborhood. They challenged every assumption the prosecution made. But as the weeks went on, the public's perception tilted further against Scott. The combination of the bodies found near his alibi location, his secret affair, and the unsettling phone recordings created a story the jury struggled to ignore. But the tie wasn't just about evidence. That had evolved into a battle over Scott Peterson's character, his honesty, and the chilling possibility that the image he projected for years had been nothing but a mask. And when the jury finally left the room to deliberate, everyone watching, inside the courthouse and across the country, knew that the verdict would either confirm or shatter the story the prosecution had built so carefully. Retelling. The jury's decision would stun the courtroom, but what happened after the verdict would spark an entirely new controversy, one that still challenges the case to this day. When the jury returned to the courtroom on the 12th of November 2004, every heartbeat in the room seemed to pause. Month of testimony, emotional recordings, heartbreaking evidence, and countless hours of media coverage had led to this moment. Scott Peterson stood still, eyes forward, as the verdict was read aloud. Guilty of first-degree murder for Laci Peterson, and guilty of second-degree murder for their unborn son, Connor. A wave of emotion rippled through the room. Some cried. Some sighed in relief, Others simply stared, absorbing the weight of the moment. Outside the courthouse, crowds erupted. Some cheering, some chanting, others standing silently with photos of Laci held to their chests. It felt to many like justice had been delivered. But the story did not end there. 4 months later, on the 16th of March, 2005, Scott Peterson was sentenced to death. One juror, Rachel Neisnick, named Strawberry Shortcake because of her bright hair, told reporters bluntly, "San Quentin is your new home." Scott was transferred to death row, where he would spend years in isolation. The public seemed satisfied. The chapter appeared closed. But behind prison walls, and in the offices of Scott's attorneys, a new battle was quietly forming. Years passed. Appeals were filed, claims were challenged, and slowly, questions began to emerge. Not about whether Scott had lied, or whether his merit was fractured, but about whether his trial pointed directly at juror number 7, Rachel Nice. During jury selection, every potential juror filled out a lengthy questionnaire asking about past legal issues, victimization, and experiences with crime. Nice had answered no to those questions. But years later, investigators uncovered that she had actually been involved in 2 prior deaths he believed should have been disclosed. Scott's legal team argued that her omission wasn't a small mistake. It was a lie that may have compromised her neutrality as a juror. The controversy grew to the point where, in 2020, the California Supreme Court reviewed the issue, and in August of that year, the court overturned Scott's death sentence, not his conviction, but the punishment. Serious errors during jury selection. Scott was removed from death row and sentenced to life without parole, yet that wasn't the most surprising development. Just months later, the Supreme Court ordered a lower court to re-examine whether Scott deserved a completely new trial. Supporters claimed that the jurors' past experiences and behavior during the trial had unfairly influenced the outcome. Prosecutors disagreed, arguing she did nothing intentionally wrong. The debate became fierce, complex, and deeply emotional. Then in 2024, the case gained new life when the Los Angeles Innocence Project announced it would be taking up Scott's fight. They pushed for access to previously undisclosed evidence and requested new DNA testing. They suggested that key details, like reported sightings of a pregnant woman walking the neighborhood, may not have been fully explored. For some, this was outrageous. For others, it was long overdue. And just like that, the Peterson case, once considered resolved, was thrust back into the spotlight. A case that began with a missing woman in 2002 was now fueling debates about justice, fairness, and truth more than 2 decades later. The world thought this case was over, but with new evidence, new advocates, and new questions rising, the Scott Peterson story may still have one more shocking chapter waiting to be told.